I'm very familiar with that unit. I've done a lot of work with them. We're scrambled to go after an unidentified flying object. Okay, I get this stuff all the time. Okay, so this is like, I usually don't even, I do a quick cursory look into it and I move on. I came across a Reddit page that was an air traffic control forum. So, these are ATC guys talking about the daily work that air traffic controllers do, not about UFOs, okay? And these guys are talking about this crazy thing that happened and going through these different time frames and what they saw and pilots that saw things. And so at that point, I'm like, well, there's something here, right? There's no way that this is just a bunch of people making things up. And that's when I reached out to the FAA. I was able to kind of recreate the time frame of the incident, doing some forensic work, and went to the FAA and went to NORAD and said, what happened during this period of time, in the skies over the Northwest? And basically NORAD came back immediately to me, and they're usually very good about this. NORAD, you cannot FOIA. You cannot do a Freedom of Information Act request with NORAD. They're exempt. So your listeners need to understand that. If they're not going to tell you something, you're not going to get it. Okay? So the fact that they called me right back and were very open about this information was kind of interesting. It meant that they probably didn't even know what this was either. So it was never classified. And what they said was, yes, there was the X, Y, and Z happened as you described it, and a few other details. So that was confirmed. And about 2 days later, I press the FAA. They come back and say, what NORAD told you is our exact statement. So this thing happened. So then I start breaking it down, and here's the story. On the 25th, late afternoon, around 3:30, 4 o'clock, and all the times were
October 2017.
25th October 2017. Yes, 2017. Oakland Center, which is the big radar department that covers that area for the FAA. One of the main guys there saw on his radar scope a unidentified contact moving south, so kind of up probably over like the Redding area, north of San Francisco. At what he says was very high speed. This is right from the tapes that we have. And this craft, he was kind of blown away by it. He's like, whoa, fast mover. What is this? And discussions occur, and immediately this craft makes a left-hand turn going north up toward Oregon, once again at quite high speed. We don't have the exact speed this thing was supposedly traveling at. But it's kind of spooked them, so it had to have been something fairly fast, okay? As this thing starts going north, it disappears off the radar scope. And at this point in time, it changes from like a quick, like off the hip investigation for the FAA. They're trying to figure out how they can track this. And they call up to the Oregon air traffic controllers that work the sectors over Oregon and say, hey, we had this thing that showed up, and it should be right in this area over Crater Lake right now, but we can't see it anymore. Is there any airliners in the area that can take a look and see if it's out there? This was a beautiful, clear day over the Northwest in October. No clouds. Okay, beautiful. The sun is going down over the coast. And one after another, multiple airliners look out their window, and they see a white flying thing at a distance that they could not identify the type of aircraft. All they can say, it was white, and it was out there. And it's flying faster than they are, but it's going right with their traffic. And that's a corridor, guys, that's like highly trafficked. That's all the flights from Seattle to LA, are coming through there. So there's a lot of planes, okay? But they eventually get 3 separate aircraft traveling kind of with it in parallel that are seeing it and are going back and forth with ATC tracking this thing. This goes on all the way until these aircraft start to descend into Portland. These flights are descending into Portland, at which time the sun's going down. So they start to lose track of it. Okay, they can't, it kind of, it blurs off into the horizon. But it's, for all intents and purposes, it continues on this course. What we know from my FOIA, which I got more tapes, not just of the ATC, the air traffic control tapes, but we actually got the phone calls between the FAA and all the different agencies, the different, control areas, and the military, trying to figure out, A, how to track this thing, since it's not showing up on radar. It's not communicating with radio and has no transponder. Okay? So in those tapes, we see people that are amazed by this to a certain extent. And not just they can't track it on radar for a moment, which happens. That happens even when an aircraft is operating, within all the normal guidelines. It drops off, it comes right back. This went up all the way up the Willamette Valley. This thing was totally off the scopes. No primary contacts the whole way up. And eventually, they're trying to figure out when to launch the fighters to do an intercept on this thing. And it's kind of odd that it took them so long to get these fighters up. But eventually, once these airplanes were landing at PDX and the sun was going down, the F-15s roared out an alert from PDX to go look for this aircraft. Those F-15s have the most powerful air-to-air radar in the world, jet fighter radar in the world. It's a new upgrade. They have an electro-optical targeting system that's a new upgrade that can zoom way in and take video of any target that's out there.
Wow.
They can fly at Mach 1.6, 1.7 while fully.
Hey, were those Strike Eagles?
No, they're C-D models.
Okay.
It's the Air National Guard there. That guard base covers all the way up into British Columbia down into Northern California. Okay? And they can be over Seattle in about 7 or 8 minutes if they have to. They're that fast. They go up. This is a real live alert, okay? They go up and they look around. They can't find anything on their radars. They can't find anything out there. So they just end up setting up the Combat Air Patrol over Battleground, which is in Washington, just north of Portland. And they're just up there, they don't know which way it went, what the deal was. In fact, for a while, we believe it sounds like on the radio they actually went the wrong direction. They went south when the craft would have been moving up. But still, they should have been able to chase this down if they could see it. End of story. F-15s didn't find anything, and it all ends. Planes land. Nobody else sees this thing. Okay? Obviously, this is a huge problem because the FAA, it is a flight safety issue when there's something flying in the airspace, the flight levels around airliners that is not communicating, they can't even track. So what we have in those tapes that are on my site, not just the air traffic control tapes, we have the investigation phone calls that followed from the head operations guy up in Seattle for the Seattle Center, and all the pilots that saw it, that watched it, and it wasn't a small plane. One of the pilots says, this wasn't a private jet. This was a big airplane, and it was white. And they couldn't even make out the type, so it was, who knows if it was an airplane. It was just big enough to be a large airliner, okay? And as things continue, you listen to these tapes, and then we get into the phone calls after they do the interviews with these pilots to see what the heck happened. The pilots want to know too, right? We get the calls with the quality assurance in Washington, D.C. These are the people that get called. Something crazy happens in the airspace, they have to investigate. They have to make sure that there's quality insurance happening in the airspace all over the United States. So airplanes don't run into each other. Terrible things don't happen.
Tyler, fast question. Were any of the pilots saying that the shape of the white object was an airliner, or was it just that there was a large object and they are just using the word airliner because they're talking about the length?
You know what's funny about it? They really don't even use the word airliner. If you listen to it, they're trying to compare this to something, right? And they just say, at one point during the investigation, the guy says it was way bigger than what a Lear jet would be, or a private jet, or a Gulfstream jet. It was like an airliner size. Mm-hmm. But nowhere do they say, it had 2 engines and a tail on it, right. This and that. So my impression is they could not make the variant or type or even what the craft was. Okay? But it was big. Not a tiny thing, not a small thing, not a weather balloon. See what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so, this continues on, and these investigations happen, and so then we get the calls with quality assurance. And this is what I want your listeners to really internalize. People think that every day the FAA is getting UFO reports and crazy stuff's going down, and jets are chasing UFOs. I hear it nonstop. It isn't. It isn't happening often, because this quality assurance manager, which is a top position there, doesn't even know how to classify this. They don't even know how to file it and who to file it to. It's like a foreign event to them. And keep in mind, they didn't think that they were going to be FOIA'd and I was going to get all these tapes. They're talking like normal people talk on the phone, normal people in an administrative setting or professional corporate setting, right? Just normal. But even they were like, wow, they're kind of like, what was this? They're weirded out by it. Okay. You can hear it in their voice. They even mention it. So that's the story. In a nutshell, I highly recommend your readers go to the site and they can experience it themselves. So they don't have to listen to me tell it. They can experience all the things that I know directly. And the last point I want to say, with all my contacts in the Northwest, especially in the military and air defense world and all that, the Air Force, nobody has ever told me that they ever had a conclusion of what that thing was.
And how long from first sighting, first airliner pilot to the sun going down was that? Right.
So I don't have it in exact numbers, but I believe it was, 45 minutes, somewhere around an hour. This wasn't just a quick 10 minutes and the thing, disappears. This was a long, multi-viewer sighting. Not just that, but by the best witnesses you can get.
Pilots. These are airline pilots, and over that 45 minutes, it was multiple pilots that were talking to each other or talking in radio.
Open frequency, and it was the FAA trying to figure out what this thing was and where this thing was exactly, because they couldn't see it anymore. And it was right there. It wasn't like, I see a dot. It's like, it's right there. They saw it. They tallied it right away.
And on radar, did anybody get a radar signature?
So we got it. We know that they had a signature originally of some sort of signature, a primary or whatever, when it was moving very fast to the south, but then it disappeared and nobody saw it since. And even in those radio or those phone recordings where they're talking to the Western Air Defense Sector up in Seattle, they're even talking right there about, boy, I'm looking for it on the radar. They're playing with their mouse ball, trying to see this thing as a primary contact, which would have just been a blob with no altitude, just a hit, right? Nobody could find it. But the pilots are like, they're talking about it right there.
And how close did this object come to any one of the airliners?
It's very interesting because it never got within visual range, right, where somebody could say, oh, that's what it was. But at the same time, I'm just, extrapolating. We were just talking about the Tic Tac earlier, the thing that happened in 2004. That was shaped like a Tic Tac. Now, there's at a certain distance, if something's flying and shaping like a Tic Tac at 550 miles an hour, I don't know if your brain can even really come up with that answer. You know what I mean? So it was a scenario where I don't think we can rely. I think we can rely on the fact that nobody could identify it as a big tell here, that it wasn't a standard looking thing, a flying machine or what have you. And I get people ask me the first thing, I've done so many interviews on this, and they say, well, what do you think it was? You're a defense guy. And I say, yeah, somebody smuggling something into Canada, it does happen, but that it would have showed up on radar and they would have seen the airplane, and there's a million things why that doesn't make sense. And those aircraft don't do super high speed and take massive G turns and head to the north. It's that that'd be like an old Learjet or an old, small airplane that may be a jet powered aircraft. But this was up at 37,000 feet. So, this is not some small prop plane here.
Right.
And it's flying at faster than 737 cruise speeds. It was outpacing everybody.
Now, Tyler, question on that, right? Okay, is it possible we've got countermeasures, electronic countermeasures now that can jumble things and make it look like on radar what it's doing, it isn't doing, and can even throw an effect to make people think they see what's going on is not really what they're seeing?
So on the electronic warfare side, yes. There's ways to definitely spoof and to play with radars, but it's not a clean thing. It would be horrific for the military that would actually go and do an electronic attack on an FAA radar to move an airplane around. Let me say this. If, say this was a secret airplane, because everybody asks, did this come out of Area 51, or was it just flying, up to somewhere? I said, absolutely not, because that's not how we know there's a history of how they move airplanes like that. They do it in the dead of night. They call the Gulfstream jet or 737 with an Air Force registration that exists, and they just move it. And they talk to ATC the whole way. They don't go and freak out the FAA and think that there's a bunch of people that are potentially, at risk, that airliners are at risk in a major corridor and cause a huge fuss doing it. It's not how they work.
Well, let me ask you, because I may have missed it, what did it actually do to affect other aircraft other than it was just picked up and they couldn't identify it?
It didn't do anything. I mean, that's the thing, is that it always stayed at a distance that it kind of was like outside the detail range.
Same thing with the Tic Tac. Same thing with the Tic Tac.
Yeah, you could tell. We listened to those tapes. You get that impression that it's weird that nobody was really close enough. At the same time, FAA is not going to tell an airliner with 135 souls on board to go investigate an unknown aircraft. So people kind of ask, like, why did they just fly closer to it? Because, I mean, literally, they have no idea what it is. The military's involved already. They're not going to take that risk. Yeah, but here's another
key. Look how long it took for the military to launch an aircraft.
I know. Like, it's a real unidentified, spotted, tracked aircraft. I'm sorry. The jets can go out in a matter of 3 or 4 minutes. They're airborne once they get the alert. So it's not like they sat on the ground and had to get going.
No, I know. When I was stationed at Castle, we actually had that at their AdTac before they closed it down. So I know exactly what goes on. But the bottom line is Tic Tac was the same way. They saw this stuff and they didn't do anything with it.
And the phenomena itself is infamous for staying at certain distances that remain consistent, even if there has been an order to identify that the phenomena itself will remove itself at a certain distance and keep a distance.
Right, like kind of keeping a bubble or a buffer zone between a pair of eyes and itself. That kind of seems like it. I mean, we could interpret it that way, on this. But even a part of this whole discussion in these tapes that you listen to was like, who gave the direction for the alert jets to scramble? Like, they're upset because they think the FAA told the military to send alert jets to go out. It's really a mess. I mean, that's kind of the other part of this. It's kind of like, you kind of sit back and you're like, boy, this is like kind of strange.
Now, let me ask you, because I've been out for a while. NORAD and the FAA are in direct contact, especially after 9/11. So there's
a hotline. There's an actual hotline that they're on, and that's on this. They discuss this hotline nonstop. They refer to it.
But you're missing one point, though. Okay, NORAD would have been tracking that.
How?
They track everything.
They use a lot of the FAA radars. It's totally changed since the Cold War. They don't have the capabilities they used to, and not just that. Like, they didn't know if this was something that they really needed to go after, they would have gone after it.
But that's my point, though, that NORAD actually does track this stuff, and the hotline itself, immediately when you have something like that is patched through to NORAD, and they are immediately brought up on the link to track this, is what I'm pointing.
Oh, absolutely.
So they were watching it immediately. They were involved immediately, because that's part of the defense of our airspace.
Absolutely.
So they would have immediately. They would have been evaluating the launch. The FAA wouldn't have asked for it.
They were. When I say Western Air Defense Sector, that is NORAD. So that is their local region that they're dealing with. And you can hear the tapes in real time with them talking to them and trying to figure out what it is, etc. So the only other thing I can think of, is that there are unmanned aircraft that get tested. In Nevada, obviously, we've been talking about the Nellis Test and Training Range. Also up by Fallon, there's aircraft that get tested. Unmanned aircraft, there's a lot of that going on. That's the future. And it's very possible that it's not very possible. There is a precedent for exotic unmanned aircraft to go off the leash and to fly over distances before regaining contact or crashing. Okay, this is all done with beyond line of sight data links that use satellite connectivity. There's an issue with that capability. Satellites
are key to this,
right? So if you lose that, there are algorithms that are built into these aircraft. But look at the RQ-170 Sentinel. That is a Batwing drone that is built by Lockheed Skunk Works. I've written just a ton on over the years. It crashed right into Iran's hands in 2011. I mean, almost undamaged. Okay,
remember it? Yeah,
that's a huge deal. That is one alien-looking thing. It is white.
Yes.
Okay, When you look at any flying wing aircraft on its edge, it is a UFO. Okay, and it won't, or to a pilot, it would be kind of like an airplane but with no tail and really no engines. It's a flying wing, because when you look on the side, it looks like a hamburger.
But Tyler, here in your warzone.com, page 8 of 22, printed out from the website, you wrote Alaska 439, which is around the Portland airport at this point. Alaska 439 asks for an update on the unidentified aircraft, and the controller notes that they still have nothing on it. Say colloquially that it must be in a kind of, quote, stealth mode or something, close quote, meaning that the airline pilots, the controllers that they are communicating with, they're talking about this something being in a stealth mode.
Yeah, that's a commonly used term in the aviation business for something that doesn't return any sort of signature. But at the same time, it shows how unique this was. They couldn't even say, oh, this is a da-da-da-da-da. They had to come up with a term like it. Now, as far as the stealth mode thing, maybe there is something more to that. Like I say, there is, we know that there's a precedent for this happening, and not just then. There's been other events where this has happened as well. With unmanned aircraft, we've lost a ton of them in different theaters that have lost that satellite communications and have malfunctioned. That is such a reach, okay, for me to put that out there. But it's one possibility among just a few handful that I can think of.
But you're talking 45 minutes, multiple airline pilots, controllers, NORAD,
yep.
FAA. I would say that this is spinning tails to not say that this was truly an unidentified phenomenon. It sounds like
it is. It
was moving at such a rapid speed, and I wonder, did any of the pilots say that used the term specifically that it made a 90-degree turn?
No, because once the pilots had it, it was on a linear trajectory. The only time when we get like a hard turn out of it, one of those crazy, where somebody actually is worth mentioning, is with Oakland Center seeing it on radar. That first moment when it shows up, it went hard to the south and then took this hard turn to the north. And it was heading at very high speed to the south. So we know that a turn to the north would have taken quite a bit of, there have been some G's involved probably in that, I'd imagine. But we don't have the exact metric of what that telemetry was. We do have radar, the large picture, the God's Eye View radar picture. The FAA, I think they built that up for us, and they sent it to us. It's actually quite impressive. But it doesn't give us just like stark telemetry on the object at the beginning of that incident, when it occurred.
Ever get kind of a anonymous, anybody contacting you and say, I know what this was?
I get that about so many things, and sometimes they're, there's great tips, right? With this, nobody has ever had any inclination of what really it was. And I'm not just talking about random people. I'm talking about people that I have sources that are like in this world that deal with this stuff on a daily basis. As far as the military, dealing with air defense and everything else, it's never come up that said, oh yeah, we can't talk about it, it's classified. You know what they've said? Nobody could ever figure it out. Yeah. So when you say, is it an unidentified flying object? Yeah, it actually is.
Yeah, by multiple airliners.
I think the FAA would say it. I think they're talking about it too. They're saying in the tapes, what do we even classify this thing as? How do we even, wow, this is weird. I mean, this is the stuff they're saying. This is not my interpretation. They're saying phrases like this, not, oh, this is a 1026C, we put it in the file bin.
Yeah, and since October of 2017, have you had any other highly strange, whether it's airliner or jet fighter or any radio traffic or radar traffic on an unknown? Yeah,
I broke the story on the Arizona UFO. That was mine that flew over the two, the Learjet and the 757, or excuse me, the Airbus A320.
Okay, so talk about how that all began.
Yeah.
What time?
That was honestly a bigger story. Actually, that was on. I think that went on every outlet around the world, but it's less compelling than the Oregon one in some ways. But just on the top of my head, it was an event. There was there was a Learjet 31, which was flown by Phoenix Air. That is not a person carrier. That is a contract aircraft that works for the military. A Learjet that has been modified to carry electronic warfare equipment and to tow targets, and it flies as if it's a missile toward our ships to simulate a missile attack on the ships. And then the ships train that way, right? And then they fly these patterns, and they train and they challenge our radio operators on our ships. This aircraft was just transiting back to its home place, its home port, flying back from San Diego where they're temporarily based. So it was flying along kind of between Tucson and the border of Arizona right there, right in that kind of that southern corridor, which is famous. Let's be honest, it's famous for UFO traffic, okay? So first thing I thought when I got this tip, I was like, that's also famous for military operating areas and military testing. So I'm interested in on multiple levels. This pilot of an airliner heard this Learjet while he was flying. He never saw it, but he was just on the edge of radio range, and he heard this crazy conversation with Albuquerque Center, where this Learjet pilot says, "Whoa, something just flew over my head, like really close, and it was big and it was shiny, and it just shot over our cockpit. Can you identify it?" And Albuquerque Center is like, they had no idea. They had no radar, nothing. And that was like, then there's some chatter with pilots kind of joking a little bit about it. But the pilot of that Phoenix Air Learjet was like, that was something else. I mean, they were spooked, okay, by this thing. Then we have the air traffic controller come on. A minute later, he says, "Hey, to this Airbus that was behind the Learjet. There's a Learjet in front of you that had something pass overhead at like 40,000 feet, so up there, okay, at high speed going the exact opposite direction. Let me know if you see anything." And what do you know? 30 seconds, 45 seconds later, it just flew right over us. It was super bright, and it was not a plane. That's kind of what they're talking about. And then there's chatter back and forth with the Learjet. They're like, it's like, well, was it a weather balloon? He goes, was it a Google balloon, which is like a weather balloon, right? He was like, I don't think so. That's what the pilot said. Clearly, this wasn't what they thought it was. And that was the last contact that was made with this particular object. Fast forward a month later, and they actually interviewed a local station. Interviewed the pilot of the Learjet, I believe. And he said the object was an incredibly bright thing. Like, it was a luminous, much brighter than like a reflection of the sun almost on like a foil or anything. It was just super bright, almost like a disc, I believe he described it as, that flew past. And that is online. You can find that particular interview. Once again, we have this very extremely trained, this is an ex-military pilot that is now flying contract duty, that has seen probably everything, okay, that you can imagine. He's out there training ships at low level in crazy conditions, okay, over off of San Diego there in the Pacific. And he was spooked by this. That crew was spooked by this. And he couldn't explain what this was. So that is just in a nutshell what happened with the Arizona sighting.
And did anybody in all of the various dialogues that you've been exposed to so far say that the object was at least circular as it flew over, as opposed to a long, elongated in wings?
Yeah, so off the top of my head, I believe that the impression was it was a circular object, or had kind of something similar. Because if it's an airplane that has wings, these are pilots. They're going to say, "Oh man, it looked like a small jet. It looked like," they talk in descriptions of airplanes on a daily basis. They don't say, "Wow, something. Well, I don't know what that was."
Right.
When do you hear that on air traffic control tapes?
Yeah.
Never. doesn't exist in that. It doesn't exist in the vernacular in that community. They don't describe things like that. And so that's why when we have these things that occur, a similar thing happened over Long Island was another one of mine. I pulled up air traffic control reports. The smaller aircraft that saw a very bright, luminous disc type object out, in front of it. And they could not explain what the heck it was. I interviewed that crew. That was a private airplane. Once again, we had the air traffic control tapes to prove it.
Well, Tyler, we have come to the end of this Phenomena Radio tonight, but we must have you come back in a few months about more of your war zone investigations of this fascinating area of what are pilots seeing and reporting officially, and that what we have heard tonight falls into the category, at least, of the unexplained. Thank you so much.